Hey Optimancers, Chris here. So I have been talking about Warlocks for the last few weeks, and I'm going to continue talking about Warlocks for at least a couple more weeks. Today I want to start talking about the actual spells that a Warlock is going to be selecting with both their Pact Magic and their Mystic Arcanum. And then in the following weeks I also want to talk about the pacts and the patrons that Warlocks can choose. And that's going to kind of finish off this series until Tasha's comes out. Because once Tasha's Cauldron of Everything comes out, of course, there's going to be some new options for Warlocks, for subclasses, for invocations, and I will be talking about those. In fact, I often get asked what I'll be talking about with Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, and the fact is I'll probably talk about just about everything in it. So there will probably be several videos coming out around the end of November and throughout December where I'm talking about the various Tasha's Cauldron of Everything new character options. But today we're going to be talking about the existing spells that are available for Warlocks. But before we do that, I do want to recognize some of the patrons I have for this channel. I have a Patreon, the link is in the video description, and the patrons I'm mentioning today really make a huge difference in my ability to give you these videos and take the time to research them and so forth. And today I want to recognize Dash Panther, Dave Peters, David F., Dewey Cheatham Howe, Eric Wasserman, Glenn Wilson, James Sprague, Jay McAvenue, and John Matera. Your support of this channel makes a huge difference. So Warlock spells, let's get started. So every spell I'm going to be going over here, I am recommending. Now, because there are so many differences in how I evaluate spells for Warlocks compared to any other caster, I'm not going to be using my standard spell rating guide because it doesn't apply. If I am looking at a higher level Warlock, suddenly the circumstantial spells look a lot better. So why would they get the same rating as a circumstantial spell at a lower level, right? And in the case of wizards and sorcerers and bards, we don't want overly circumstantial spells. With a warlock, we might want those spells. So I can't look at them the same way, so I can't use my same ranking guide because it doesn't make sense. So I'm just telling you right now, I'm recommending all the spells I'm going to be going over, and I'll explain why as I go over them. So first, let's talk about the selections for Pact Magic, and the first thing we should talk about is Cantrips. Warlocks are going to begin the game with 2 cantrips, and eventually they will have 4 cantrips. As I mentioned in my Pact Magic video, I do think that if you are playing a Warlock that is not specializing in the use of weapons, taking Eldritch Blast is pretty much going to be my first selection and pretty much a must. Warlocks need to do something in between the turns that they're casting leveled spells, and we want that thing they do to be effective, and Warlocks have the ability to be more effective in those rounds than a lot of other spellcasters. Eldritch Blast is the most common way that that is achieved, and so when I'm making a character, I'm either going to be using weapons effectively or I'm going to be using Eldritch Blast effectively if I'm playing a Warlock. So Eldritch Blast is pretty much always going to be my first selection unless I'm making a specialized build where weapons are my specialty. And even then, unless ranged weapons is part of that combination, I'm still taking Eldritch Blast. The next cantrips I'm going to be looking at, I'm going to talk about these together, is Booming Blade and Green Flame Blade. Now, I won't necessarily take them both because, again, we only have 2 selections to begin with. We're only ever going to have 4 selections. So having both of them is a luxury I may not be able to afford, even though I would like to have both of them on pretty much any Warlock build if I'm ever going to use a weapon. And even if I'm an Eldritch Blast focused Warlock, there is a reasonable chance that once in a while I will end up in melee. And unless I have the Crossbow Expert feat that will negate the disadvantage that Eldritch Blast would have when I get into melee, then I'm probably going to want to have at least a weapon and use Booming Blade or Green Flame Blade with it to do at least reasonable damage. Now, if I'm playing a Hexblade, I'm probably actually pretty good using a melee weapon. And again, Booming Blade or Green Flame Blade is going to be something I'm really going to be looking at, especially if I'm not playing Pact of the Blade. If I am playing Pact of the Blade, there's a good chance that at level 5 I will be getting an extra attack when I take the attack action. And so I'll be more inclined to take the attack action rather than casting a spell. And Booming Blade and Green Flame Blade are not part of the attack action, they are casting a spell. So if I'm playing a Tome Pact or a Chain Pact Warlock, then Booming Blade and Green Flame Blade is more likely for me to take than Pact of the Blade, and especially if I'm playing a Hexblade because I'm using my Charisma bonus instead of my Dexterity or my Strength as the ability I'm using for those attacks. So I become actually reasonably good using the melee weapon even if I'm not Pact of the Blade because of Booming Blade or Green Flame Blade. And it is very possible, depending on how often I end up in melee combat, that at some point I might even pick up the other one, so I would have both Booming Blade and Green Flame Blade. And there's a lot of question about which of these is the better cantrip, and I don't have a strong opinion one way or another. Booming Blade is definitely better in some situations, and Green Flame Blade is definitely better in others. I think the main difference between the two, as far as I'm concerned, is Green Flame Blade is the one you know if it's going to be effective before you attack. Booming Blade is the one that is sometimes more effective than Green Flame Blade, but you don't know until after your turn is over. Obviously, Booming Blade does a more reliable kind of damage, but as much as we talk about reliable kinds of damage, the fact is that most of the time it doesn't make a difference. Yes, there are a lot of creatures in the game that are resistant or immune to fire, but there's even more creatures that aren't. The next cantrip I'm going to consider is the Friends cantrip. Now, just in general, I think Friends is pretty good on a Warlock, mainly because Warlocks are a Charisma-based class. So you are going to already be pretty good at Charisma-based skills. Good chance that you selected some Charisma-based skills when you're making your character. And Friends is a way to enhance what you're already good at. Of course, I don't have to tell you the disadvantage of Friends is after a minute, that creature becomes hostile to you. Now, if your intent was to intimidate them or maybe to provoke them, that's not a problem at all. But if your intent was to actually make friends with them, then that's a big problem. If you were trying to deceive them, that's a big problem. But when I'm really going to be interested in looking at the Friends cantrip is if I have the Mask of Many Faces invocation. And this is how it's going to work well with Friends. Imagine you have a situation where you are trying to maybe deceive an NPC. With Mask of Many Faces, I can disguise myself to appear as somebody else. Then I can attempt the deception or whatever kind of social interaction I'm trying to do with the advantage that Friends gives me. A minute later, after the spell expires, that creature becomes hostile to me, but it only knows me by a certain appearance. If that appearance never exists again, there's no reason for that NPC to even know who I am. But honestly, even if I'm playing a Warlock that doesn't have that invocation, there's a good chance I'm going to be looking at Friends regardless because it is an enhancement of what I am specialized in. The next cantrip I'm going to consider is Minor Illusion. I've done an entire video on Minor Illusion, so take a look at that if you haven't seen it already, but Minor Illusion is a good cantrip. And if I can get it on my cantrip list, there's a good chance I'm going to take it. And that is true with Warlocks as well. Now that said, I should mention that Minor Illusion I think is a little bit less enticing to a Warlock than other casters. And the reason for that is the same reason why I consider Warlocks should probably take Eldritch Blast, and that is because we have bigger sections of time between casting leveled spells. And we are looking for very effective things to do in that time. Now, Minor Illusion is something that other kinds of casters can do in between those leveled spell castings to do something useful. But the bar is a little bit lower for those other casters in terms of what they need to be able to accomplish in those turns. And it's a little bit higher for Warlocks because it's going up against Eldritch Blast. It's going up against potentially effective weapon use. And if you have that higher bar, the effectiveness of Minor Illusion falls in comparison somewhat. So it isn't a must-have for Warlocks as I would normally consider it for most casters, but I still think it is a pretty good selection. So let's get into our level 1 spells. Now, before we get started on this, I want to just remind people what I talked about in last week's video, and that was that Pact magic creates a very unique relationship between spells known and number of spells per short rest. At very low levels, we don't have a lot of spells known, and we can expect to be casting pretty much all of them. Once we get into higher levels, especially once we get to that level 10 range, then we're going to find that we have a ton of spells known and just not enough castings to cast them all. So most of our spells are going to end up uncast, and that makes circumstantial spells far more useful in the situations where we are those higher levels. So when I'm looking at low level spells, those circumstantial spells are less attractive to me. But when I'm looking at the higher level spells, they're more attractive. And so I just want to make that context clear before we get into it. But let's talk about level 1. So at level 1 and level 2 of our Warlock, we will be looking exclusively at first level spells. And there are 4 first level spells I think a Warlock should consider. The first one is a kind of iconic for Warlocks, and that is Armor of Agathys. Armor of Agathys does 2 things for you. Number 1, it is going to provide you temporary hit points, and number 2, it is going to do damage to enemies that attack you. The duration of 1 hour is pretty good, and it doesn't use your concentration. Now, one of the reasons why Armor of Agathys is so iconic for Warlocks is because it scales very well. So we get 5 hit points and 5 points of damage when we cast it as a level 1 spell, but if we cast it as a level 5 spell, it's 25 temporary hit points and 25 points of damage. So the scaling is really, really strong, and because Warlocks automatically scale their spells as they level up, Armor of Agathys is one of those spells that continues to be effective as we go up in levels. And we also need to consider that quite often Warlocks end up being melee characters, especially if you're playing Pact of the Blade. We can often expect our characters to be in melee, but we are working off D8 hit points, which is lower than the average for martial characters. And Armor of Agathys bridges that gap for us. But even if we aren't going into melee, just that extra padding of hit points can be really good for a Warlock. But I do think Armor of Agathys is more attractive if I'm playing a martial style of Warlock. Second spell I will consider is also iconic for Warlocks, and that is the Hex spell. Hex has a pretty good range at 90 feet, which means we can pretty much always combine it with our ranged attacks or our melee attacks. It's a bonus action to use, so it's not going to interfere with us taking the attack action or casting a spell. And it provides a damage bonus every time we hit that opponent with an attack. And that attack might be a weapon attack, that attack might be a spell attack. And of course, once we are doing multiple spell attacks or multiple weapon attacks, we will be adding the hex damage to every attack. Now, D6 might not sound like a huge increase in damage, but if you think about even a level 1 Warlock, so you can use Eldritch Blast, it's going to do an average damage of 5.5 on a D10. So adding an average damage of 3.5 on a D6, that's an increase of over 60% to your total damage. That's a big increase. And because Hex has a duration of an hour, and because we can recover it with a short rest or a long rest, we could potentially have Hex up all the time. Now, Hex is concentration, and we might lose our concentration. But unless we do lose our concentration, there's a good chance we'll be able to add Hex damage to all our damage rolls. There's certain multi-classes where our bonus action gets taken up all the time, and then the Hex isn't so good. You need to have your bonus action available. But if you have your bonus action available, I think Hex is a really good selection at first level. Now, the question is Hex still effective at high levels? Because when I do baseline damage, I talk about using the Warlock for that, and I talk about using the Hex spell, and I talk about using the Hex spell right up to 20th level. Is that actually what I would suggest to do? And the answer to that is probably not. Hex is normally not a spell I'm going to be casting at higher levels because there are more effective things I can be doing with my concentration. There's also other ways I can add damage that might add more damage than a Hex spell. But I don't agree with the notion that we should never cast Hex as a high-level Warlock. Actually, the difference between getting advantage on your Eldritch Blast or using Hex on your Eldritch Blast in terms of damage levels, even at higher levels, is not as big as you would think it is. Although advantage does apply more damage with your Eldritch Blast than Hex does, the difference is actually very minute. So if we're looking at something like, say, Shadow of Moil, for example, as an offensive spell, and I should note that spells like Shadow of Moil have a defensive component as well, but if we're just looking at them in terms of offense, Hex isn't much worse than Shadow of Moil, and it doesn't take that action to set up in the first place. So I don't think Hex becomes obsolete at high levels, and I'm probably going to keep it at high levels. Now, the scaling of Hex allows the duration to increase when you cast it at a higher level, and eventually we will get the spell for 24 hours. I'm not necessarily caring about that because it is unlikely I'm going to be wanting to use my concentration for the entire day on a single first level spell. But as a simple damage boost that is easy to apply and is going to increase my damage, potentially over multiple combats, I think Hex is something that I'm definitely going to want at first level, and I'm probably going to keep it on my list. It's maybe not a spell I would expect to cast at higher levels, but as we talk about the relationship between spells known and the number of castings, Hex is one of those ones that I'm just going to keep there. And when I need just a simple way to improve my damage a little bit, if I'm not concentrating on something else, Hex is something I'm absolutely going to consider applying. Because although D6 damage isn't a lot of damage, once we're applying several Eldritch Blasts around, and we have combats with several rounds in them, that ends up not being 1d6, that ends up being many d6s. And if doing damage is part of what you do, and with a Warlock it usually is. Usually damage is part of what you do, especially if you're using just Eldritch Blast and Agonizing Blast. Then we would expect Hex to always provide a significant bonus to damage. Next spell I'd look at first level is Hellish Rebuke. Now, first level, I'm probably not worrying about Hellish Rebuke. But at second level I might. And the difference is the spell slots, because if you only have one spell slot, if you cast Hex, for example, and I think you'd be much better off casting Hex than Hellish Rebuke, then you don't have the slot available for Hellish Rebuke. So the only time you'd be using Hellish Rebuke is if you have more than one spell slot. That happens at second level. Then you might have the one slot, set up your Hex, and then to do a little bit of extra damage, you have the second slot for your Hellish Rebuke. And it's actually a fair amount of damage. 2d10 is pretty good damage for second level. At first level, we don't have a lot of reaction spells for Warlocks, so Hellish Rebuke is kind of unique in that regard. Now, if you are a Hexblade, you have access to the Shield spell, but if you are not a Hexblade, Hellish Rebuke is basically your reaction spell. You can use your reaction to inflict some fire damage on the attacker. Now, I will say that if I'm playing a melee Warlock, I think I'm better off with Armor of Agathys than with Hellish Rebuke. But if I am playing a ranged Warlock, I might expect to take less attacks from melee. And the only way that Armor of Agathys does damage to an attacker is if you're hit with a close range attack. Hellish Rebuke allows you to do damage to a long range attacker. And that's why Hellish Rebuke might be a better option if you are a ranged Warlock. Now the thing about Hellish Rebuke is I don't think this is something I would keep on my spell list. I don't see the advantage of keeping it as we get into mid-levels because although the damage does scale with level, and the scaling isn't terrible, we're getting a d10 with each leveled spell, we are going to get other things we can do with our reaction. We're going to get far more powerful spells that we can be casting with our Pact slots, And so using this as a reaction to do some damage to an enemy isn't necessarily worth those Pact slots, in my opinion, at higher levels. So this is something I would probably look at maybe second level, and then I might switch it out at higher levels. And speaking of spells I'd probably switch out, if I'm playing a Pact of the Tome Warlock, I'm almost certainly taking the Book of Ancient Secrets Invocation. And once I do so, I will have the ability to cast ritual spells. I would be looking at Comprehend Languages unless somebody else in your party has it. This is one of those ritual spells that is pretty rare in the fact that it's on the Warlock spell list. The Warlock spell list doesn't have a lot of ritual tag spells because most Warlocks, of course, can't cast rituals. Comprehend Languages is on the Warlock spell list, and it's one of the better rituals in the game in that it does come up and it is useful. But I wouldn't necessarily keep Comprehend Languages on my spell list. Certainly if I can get Comprehend Languages in my Book of Ancient Secrets by any method, then once it is in there, I don't need to have Comprehend Languages as a known spell anymore. And the second thing is if you have the ability to do something like Scribe Scrolls, you could potentially scribe your own Comprehend Languages spell and then use your own scroll to put it in your Book of Ancient Secrets. And once you do so, the only reason to keep Comprehend Languages as a known spell would be to cast it as a non-ritual, so that you could cast it faster. I don't think that's worth a spell known, so this is something that I might put on my spell list, then get it in my Book of Ancient Secrets, and then get it off my spell list again on the next level. So I want to talk about some of the spells that are available to certain patrons. And remember that your patron spell list aren't automatically known. You may select them, but you don't have to select them, and they count against your spells known. So they're not like domain spells. But depending on your patron, there's a couple first level spells I'd definitely consider selecting. Archfey actually gets a nice list at first level. They get Faerie, Fire, and Sleep as options. Sleep is one of the best first level spells in the game when you are first level. Doesn't stay that way, but at first level it is really good. And if you can get it back with a short rest, that's doubly so. Now Sleep I would absolutely switch out. Sleep becomes a far less effective spell as you go up in levels, and although it does scale, it doesn't scale at nearly the rate that the hit points of the enemies scale at. So Sleep is very effective at first level, but it loses ground quickly. So this is something I might select as my very first spell at first level, but by the time I'm third or fourth level, I'm looking to switch that out. Faerie Fire is a spell I might consider for my Warlock. Now Faerie Fire does use your concentration, so you're not doing this at the same time as a Hex spell or anything. But Faerie Fire is a pretty effective spell. It's area of effect, so it can affect multiple enemies, provides advantage to attack those enemies, and another reason why you might want to have Faerie Fire on your spell list is to deal with invisible enemies. Invisible enemies can be a real pain in the neck, but Faerie Fire can take care of that for you. Next first level spell I would definitely consider is Cure Wounds. Now this is available to the Celestial Patron, and if I am playing a Chain Pact Warlock, then Cure Wounds is really good because I am probably going to be looking at Gift of the Ever-Living Ones as one of my invocations, and although I don't consider Cure Wounds a particularly effective healing spell, if I'm maximizing it, and Gift of the Ever-Living Ones will basically maximize it whenever I cast it on myself, then I think it's pretty good at first level, and I think it's pretty good cast as a 5th level spell as well. I mean, that's 45 points of damage you're healing with a single Pact slot if you're casting it on yourself at levels 9 or above. I mean, that's not as much as a heal spell, but we're getting in that territory. Now, if I am a Hexblade, I am definitely going to consider taking the Shield spell, especially if I'm playing a melee character. Now, Shield is, again, one of the better first level spells in the game, but Shield does not scale at all. So that means unless I'm going to multi-class with another spellcaster that's going to give me some first level slots, Shield isn't something I'm going to keep. But if we can get spell slots from a multi-class, then Shield is something not only will I take, I'll keep it. I will also look at Wrathful Smite from Hexblade. Now this is only on a weapon using Warlock. If I'm not using weapons regularly, I don't think it's worth having Wrathful Smite. But if I am, Wrathful Smite is a way that I can improve upon just doing damage with my attacks. But Wrathful Smite is a way we can inflict a pretty debilitating condition on an enemy. And I've talked about Wrathful Smite in previous spell videos. It is a very difficult spell to shake off once it affects you. Because if you fail your initial saving throw, now you're making checks at disadvantage to try to get rid of it in the future, and that's even using your action. So Wrathful Smite, if it connects in the first place, can absolutely take an enemy right out of the action. And their odds of getting back into the action are very low. So that brings us into our second level spells. So these are going to be available at level 3, and there are a lot of spells that I'm going to want to take, potentially switching out first level spells for, because there are a lot of second level spells for Warlock that are very good, though they don't all remain good as we go higher in level. So a lot of them are ones that I'm going to grab at level 3 or level 4, and then I'm going to switch them out later. This includes Mirror Image, just a fantastic defensive spell, but doesn't scale, not worth keeping on your spell list forever. But when I'm 3rd level as a Warlock, I want Mirror Image. Another one I really want is Misty Step. Misty Step is our first teleport as a Warlock. Again, it doesn't scale with level, and we get better teleport options later. So Misty Step kind of follows this pattern where we take Misty Step, and then we switch it out for the next best teleport, and then we switch that out for the next best teleport. So 3rd, 4th level, Misty Step's great on my spell list. By 5th level, I am switching it out. Shatter. Shatter is our first decent area of effect spell as a Warlock, and Warlocks don't get a lot of good area of effect options. Now, Shatter doesn't remain good. Once Fireball enters the game, then Shatter's damage is absolutely overshadowed, and it's not worth casting, even if we're scaling it. But when you're level 3, Shatter actually does a reasonable amount of damage, and it can make a significant impact on a combat, because you can hit several enemies with it. And as a Warlock, often we are focused on doing damage, but usually we're focused on doing damage to a single enemy. Shatter is going to give us a chance to do some area of effect damage. And especially if you don't have another area of effect damage caster, that's when I would really be looking at Shatter. But again, it's just not worth keeping. Once our spells are scaling to 3rd or 4th level, I'd be switching it out to those more potent 3rd or 4th level spells. Suggestion is a really strong spell, but again, it is a spell that isn't going to scale well, and I just probably wouldn't keep it. There are a couple 2nd level spells, though, that I'm very likely to look at taking, and I'm looking at potentially keeping them right through the career of my character. The first is Darkness. Now, Darkness does not scale, but Darkness has such an effective combination with the Devil's Sight Invocation that if I have Devil's Sight, I want to have Darkness. And although I may not use it all the time, because sometimes Darkness is not friendly to your companions, it's still something you want to have in your tool belt if you have Devil's Sight. Even if you're not using it, the idea that you might need to use it, and when you do, it's so effective. It's one of those circumstantial spells that we want on our spell list, even at higher levels. And although it is going to feel a little disgusting using a 5th level spell slot to cast Darkness, it is still a spell I would want to have there. Now, if I don't have Devil's Sight, I'm probably not taking Darkness in the first place. The second one I would consider is Shadowblade. Specifically, if I want to play a type of Warlock that is going to be doing melee, then Shadowblade is something I want to consider. Shadowblade is a bonus action casting. It's going to get around things like resistance or immunity to non-magical weapons. The damage type it does is Psychic, which is one of the most reliable sources of damage in the game. You get advantage if you're in dim light or darkness, and those are actually both reasonably common. And it scales with level. And if we're doing multiple attacks in a turn, as we would if we are, say, a Pact of the Blade, or if we've multiclassed in such a way that we would get extra attack, Shadowblade is going to inflict a lot more damage, and it's probably something I'd be looking at keeping, because if we can cast Shadowblade with a 5th level slot, it is worth that 5th level slot. Another 2nd level spell that I would consider taking and keeping, in fact it's a 2nd level spell I might even come back to later on, is Whole Person. And this is one of those spells I look at Warlock very differently than I look at it for, say, Wizards. Because with Wizards, I've talked about Hold Person and I've said it's too circumstantial. Because you can only affect humans. And of course, it's one of those single target spells where if they make their save, nothing happens. So those are 2 strikes against it. But in the case of Warlocks, both those strikes are actually alleviated to some degree. The first is, it's circumstantial, yes. But once I get to higher levels, circumstantial spells are just fine. And number 2, because of the way it scales, it stops being one of those spells that affects single targets. Because Hold Person, each time you level it, it affects an additional target. So eventually, we'll be affecting 4 targets with a Hold Person spell. So if I can paralyze 4 of my enemies with a spell slot, that's a really good spell slot. That is a huge effect on a combat. And even if it's circumstantial, that's fine because I'm a Warlock. So I'll keep it in my pocket. And when the time comes when we face a bunch of humanoids in a combat, I have a very effective spell I can use. Now when it comes to the Patron specific Pact spells, the 2nd level spell I'd potentially consider is Phantasmal Force, and this really depends. So much about Phantasmal Force, as with most illusions, depends on how the DM interprets the spell. And it's one of those cases where just because the spell doesn't say that you can't do something doesn't mean you can do something. And it really depends on your DM. Phantasmal Force can be the intelligence save spell that completely debilitates an enemy, or it could be the intelligence save spell that does very little. And there is a graduating range of things it could be in between. So I would potentially consider Phantasmal Force, but you really need to talk to your DM about how they would react to certain uses of Phantasmal Force, because you might find that you can't do the things you thought you could do. You want to put a bucket over somebody's head? Well, if the DM determines that bucket doesn't move with the person, which there's nothing in the spell that says it does, then your illusion isn't going to do very much. So have that conversation. So that brings us to level 3 spells. And Warlocks actually have a really nice level 3 spell list. Warlocks don't have a huge spell list overall, but at level 3, a lot of the best spells in the game are right there on the Warlock spell list. First one I want to talk about is Hypnotic Pattern. This is one of my favorite 3rd level spells in the game. I think it might be the best 3rd level spell in the game. And it's on the Warlock spell list. Am I going to take it? For sure. Am I going to keep Hypnotic Pattern? And the answer is yes. I'll cast Hypnotic Pattern with a 5th level slot. I'm not necessarily always going to use my 5th level slot on Hypnotic Pattern, but in the cases where Hypnotic Pattern is effective, it's worth a 5th level slot as far as I'm concerned. Same goes for Fear. Now, I would probably not bother taking both Hypnotic Pattern and Fear. I'd have one or the other because they do kind of a similar thing. They're going to debilitate a bunch of enemies that happen to not be immune to either the Charmed or the Frightened condition. And a lot of the creatures that are immune to one are immune to the other. But am I taking one or the other? Absolutely. And I'm probably going to keep it. Now, I'm not necessarily always going to be casting it at higher levels, but there's nothing really that replaces them. Hypnotic Pattern and Fear remain effective at high levels, and as a Warlock, we don't really have a replacement spell, so I'm going to keep one of them on my spell list. Now, talking about switching out Misty Step, the one I'm going to switch it out for is Thunder Step. Thunder Step is the next graduation in teleportation spells, and it's a better teleportation spell. For one thing, it has a greater range, but more importantly, we can take along a passenger. And that taking along a passenger is a very big deal. And it allows us to use teleports in a lot more ways than we could with just a Misty Step. Now, it's going to use a full action instead of a bonus action, but it's worth using that full action. Another really great spell I'm going to be wanting on my spell list is Counterspell. Now, the scaling of Counterspell is somewhat circumstantial. I mean, eventually we'll be able to automatically counterspell 5th or 4th level spells, when normally it's not automatic if you use a 3rd level slot. That's a pretty minute increase, but Counterspell is always a really important spell to have. And with a Warlock, even at higher levels, I'm more than willing to use a 5th level slot to use a Counterspell when it could totally change an encounter. But now that we're getting into level 3 spells, let's look at some of the more circumstantial spells that I would want to have on my spell list. Again, As a wizard or a sorcerer or as a bard, I'm less likely to look at these spells, but with a warlock, I'm actually more likely to look at these spells. The first one is Dispel Magic. Dispel Magic is more circumstantial than Counterspell, but I do find it is a very effective spell sometimes. And so it is a spell I would probably want on my list. Second one is Major Image. Now, just like with Phantasmal Force, this is an illusion spell. We need to be talking with our DM to determine how they're going to work with illusion spells, because so much relies on DM interpretation. But I do think that Major Image is one of those spells that is occasionally going to be very useful in most campaigns. And when it is one of those kinds of spells, I want it on my list. Again, most days I probably won't even cast it, but I'll have it there for the moments where I need it. Remove Curse. This is one of those spells that I'd almost never consider on a caster because it's so circumstantial. But again, with a Warlock, we can have it on our list, and we may never cast it. But when that moment comes where Remove Curse is what you need, in almost every party, no one is going to have it when you need it. But a Warlock has that option, so I'd at least consider it. Because if it does come up, it's going to be huge. Now, one that's not quite as dramatic, but it's probably going to come up a little more often, but it's still pretty circumstantial, is Tongues. Again, sometimes you just need to communicate with somebody, and there's no way to do it, but Tongues can give you that communication. And you are playing a charisma-based character, so you're probably decent at the social abilities, and having the ability to communicate with anything, regardless of their language, is something that is going to come up once in a while. And again, something I'm probably not casting on the average day, but it's there if I need it. So if I'm looking at those circumstantial spells to start padding out my spells known, spells like Remove Curse, Tongues, and Dispel Magic start showing up. Now, as I get into the higher levels, one spell I'm probably coming back to level 3 for is Fly. And that is because Fly has scaling that is so good that casting Fly with a 5th level spell is 3 times as good as casting it with a 3rd level slot. Because Fly is going to give you the ability to give flight to 3 different people. So Fly can be a very good tactical spell, it can be a very good utility spell, and being able to cast it on 3 people is a big deal. When I look at my patron spells that are available at 3rd level, one I would definitely consider is Plant Growth. One thing I really like about Plant Growth is it is a very effective battlefield control, and now I've seen it used at times when I don't think it should have been used. I don't think it is always to your benefit. You have to know you don't need the mobility and your enemies do. But when that happens, Plant Growth is extremely effective, doesn't provide a save, doesn't use your concentration, massive area. I'd be looking at Fireball. If I'm playing a Fiend Pact Warlock and I'm 5th level, Fireball is something I want to have. And I'm going to be able to cast more Fireballs than the 5th level Wizard or the 5th level Sorcerer. Now, am I keeping Fireball? Absolutely not. Once I can get level 4 spells, Fireball goes out. But at levels 5 and level 6, I would love to have Fireball on a Warlock. And that brings us into our level 4 spells. Now, the level 4 spell list isn't as tasty as the level 3 spell list. The level 3 spell list for Warlocks, I think, is really good. But level 4 has some decent options for us. The first one I want to talk about is Dimension Door. Because, again, this is our next level of teleport. So we're going to take our Thunderstep, and we're going to switch it out for Dimension Door. And this is going to give us 2 main advantages. The first is that our range increases significantly of the teleport, and the second is we no longer need to see the location we teleport to, and that is really good. So Dimension Door is better than Thunderstep significantly, so let's switch it out right now. Other spell I really like at level 4 is Summon Greater Demon, because we can summon something like the Tanaruk, and it is just going to be a huge pile of hit points and damage that we throw on the other side of the enemies, and it doesn't have anything ranged, it doesn't have a lot of mobility, so the concerns about it attacking the party are less than it is with a lot of other Summon Greater Demons, and it is going to have an impact on that combat. It's difficult for the enemies to take that darn thing down. And it's there just attacking and eating up their hit points. Now, the duration of an hour is wasted because there's no way in heck you are going to be able to keep control of any demon, no matter how bad their charisma saving throw is, for an hour. It's not going to happen because eventually it's going to roll well. I mean, we're only talking about a d20. So once every 20 rounds, I would be expecting them to roll a 20 on their saving throw, even if they don't have advantage, which they very possibly do. But for one combat, Summon Greater Demon is a really good spell, and something that Warlocks really don't have anything else that does that kind of thing up to this point. So I would definitely look at that one. Another spell I would consider is Shadow of Moil. So Shadow of Moil is actually a fair bit like an improved invisibility. Now, you're not technically invisible, but the main benefits of improved invisibility are advantage on attacks and disadvantage to be attacked, and Shadow of Moil provides those. It also does damage to creatures within 10 feet that hit you with attacks. So when your concentration is tested by somebody hitting you with a melee attack or just outside of melee, we're doing additional damage to them as well, which we wouldn't get with an improved invisibility. Now, the one thing I don't like about Shadow of Moil is that it is self only. There's a huge advantage with improved invisibility in the ability to cast it on somebody else. But if we're using Shadow of Moil and we have something like, say, Eldritch Smite, and maybe we have Hexblade Curse, this is a good way to fish for crits, for example. Next spell I consider is Sickening Radiance. Sickening Radiance is one of those area of effect spells that has continuous effects. Now, it does use up our concentration, but Sickening Radiance works very well with abilities to control enemy movement. Because what it does is, in addition to continually doing damage, is also piling levels of exhaustion onto enemies. And it doesn't matter how many hit points an enemy has, once they have a few levels of exhaustion, they're going to be a piece of cake to take out. And it's not even inconceivable that somebody might die of exhaustion through use of the Sickening Radiance spell. And being that as a Warlock, we probably already have some ways through Eldritch Blast, for example, to control enemy movement, we can potentially make some pretty good use out of Sickening Radiance. It's not one of the best 4th level spells in the game, but I do think that it works pretty nicely on a Warlock. Another spell I would consider with my 4th level slots is Banishment, but again, this is one that I might not take right at 7th level, because Banishment is a spell that is scaling so well when we cast it with a 5th level slot, because we can affect 2 enemies instead of 1. It's basically twice as good. Remember, Banishment takes an enemy completely out of the fight, and it is a charisma saving throw, and a lot of creatures that have great saving throws don't have great charisma saving throws. Now, in terms of Patron slots, number 1, if you're even thinking about Shadow of Moil, if Greater Invisibility is an option, I'd take Greater Invisibility instead. Evard's Black Tentacles, if that's available to you, I'd probably be looking at that as well. Probably before Sickening Radiance, in fact, because I think that Black Tentacles has that ability to actually control enemy movement that Sickening Radiance doesn't have. And that brings us into our 5th level spells. So when I get to 9th level, the first spell I'm probably going to take is Synaptic Static. And this is probably going to be my go-to spell with my Pact slots from now on. Not that I'm going to cast Synaptic Static in every combat. If I'm fighting a single tough enemy, I'm not using Synaptic Static. But in any case where area of effect damage is the option to go for, Synaptic Static is going to be my best option. It is the size and damage of a fireball, but there are a lot of advantages of Synaptic Static over Fireball. The first is intelligence saving throw. And creatures tend to have bad intelligence saving throws. Means that more creatures are going to fail their saves, and which means that, number 1, there's going to be more damage. Speaking of more damage, it does psychic damage instead of fire damage. A lot of creatures, especially when we get into higher levels, are going to be resistant or immune to fire. But psychic damage is one of the most reliable types of damage in the game. So when we look at both the more effective saving throw targeted and the more effective damage type, it's very likely a Synaptic Static is going to be doing more damage than even a 5th level fireball. But that on its own doesn't make Synaptic Static great. What makes Synaptic Static great is it does that, but in addition, it debuffs your enemies. because if they fail their intelligence save, what they're going to get is a d6 that's minused from all their attack rolls and their constitution saving throws and their ability checks, but the main thing is their attack rolls. D6 off an attack roll is a big deal. If we think about how effective Bless is, and a lot of people don't realize this, but just keep track next time somebody casts Bless, how many misses are turned into hits by that spell. It is huge, and Synaptic Static has even a bigger impact because it is subtracting a d6 off their attack rolls. That's going to be a lot of hits turned into misses. And creatures can get rid of this effect, but it requires a successful intelligence saving throw. In some cases, creatures may not even be able to achieve a successful saving throw with an intelligence save. So this becomes a very effective mass debuff that doesn't use your concentration. And it does a bunch of damage on top of that. So this is kind of going to be my go-to spell from now on. Another spell I'm considering at level 5 is Dream. Now, Dream is a super circumstantial spell, but again, we're looking for circumstantial spells. I already have my go-to spell, that's Synaptic Static. Dream is one of those once-in-a-while spells. Speaking of circumstantial spells that I'll want with my level 5 slots, Scrying. Scrying is a good spell, but it doesn't come up all the time. But when it does, it can be super impactful. So with a Warlock, this is the kind of spell that I want to consider. Now, when we're talking about patron spells, one of the patron spells that I would definitely take is Greater Restoration. Again, not a spell I'm going to need all the time, but boy, when somebody gets petrified, for example, nothing but Greater Restoration is going to help them. And it is not uncommon at all for the cleric to be unable to fit it on their spell list, if you have a cleric at all. So those are the Pact spells I would recommend. Now I want to talk about Mystic Arcanum, but before we get into the actual spells I'm recommending, remember that with Mystic Arcanum, we need to look at spells very differently than we look at Pact spells. With Mystic Arcanum, we have an enemy, and that enemy is circumstantial spells. I only want to be taking Mystic Arcanum ever that I am going to be casting every day. If I don't know when I'm going to be able to cast it, I don't want it, even if it's a good spell. And this makes the selections for Mystic Arcanum actually remarkably easy. In most cases, I know exactly the spell I want, although sometimes there are some strong runner-ups, and I'll mention what they are. When we get to level 6, the spell I recommend for you is Mass Suggestion. Mass Suggestion, no matter how your DM interprets it, it's going to be a great spell. You can affect several enemies. It doesn't use concentration. Tell those enemies to flee from the combat. It's like a concentration-free fear spell without even needing to inflict the frighten condition, so it would bypass immunity. There's utility uses as well, but it is definitely a spell I'll be casting every day. Now, I do think the runner-up at level 6 and one that I might go for if I want to do something different once in a while is Eyebite. Now, Eyebite does use concentration. It only affects one creature per turn, but it does last for 10 turns, so we can potentially affect several creatures with it. And one thing I definitely like about Eyebite is I will have no problem casting this every day. That brings us to our level 7 spells. And the runaway winner here is Forcecage. Forcecage should be the best 7th level spell in the game. It's not because Simulacrum exists, but in a world where Simulacrum doesn't exist, or a sensible DM bans or nerfs that spell, then Forcecage is far and away the best 7th level spell in the game. As much as we talk about Wall of Force, Forcecage is vastly superior to Wall of Force because it is bigger, because we have options on whether it has spaces or not in the walls, and because it doesn't use their concentration, and because it restricts teleportation. Forcecage is fantastic, and it just wins combats, and it is the spell you want against that enemy that has legendary resistance and is going to be a bitch to fight. You can beat that fight against that super tough dragon with a single action, and there's nothing they can do about it. Forcecage is amazing, and far and away the selection I'm going to be taking with my level 7 selection, though I'm going to mention a couple of runners up here. I'm almost always going to take Forcecage. First runner up is Crown of Stars. One thing I do like about Crown of Stars is because it doesn't use our concentration, it is a way we can increase our damage that doesn't really interfere with the other things we're doing. Now it does use up our bonus action, but there's a good chance we're not using the Hex spell anymore, so it's not interfering with our Hex spell. Good chance we're still using things like Eldritch Blast, and maybe we're combining them instead with things like improved invisibility, which Crown of Stars would benefit from. Now the amount of extra damage that Crown of Stars is going to end up inflicting isn't massive, especially considering we're only casting it once a day. But if you really want to focus on damage, Crown of Stars is going to improve your damage. And are you going to be able to cast it every day? Absolutely yes. And the final runner-up I mentioned for level 7, and for a very specialized kind of Warlock, I'd definitely consider it, is Finger of Death. Now, Finger of Death as a base attack spell, I'd say is a C, maybe a C-. I mean, it does decent damage to a single target, but we do damage to single targets as Warlocks already, so it's more of what we kind of already do. The thing that is special about Finger of Death is if you kill a creature with it, it comes back as a zombie under your control, and there is no duration. This means that even in downtime, we will be casting Finger of Death every day. And if you want to be the Warlock that builds the massive army of undead servants, Finger of Death as your 7th level selection is the way to do it. That brings us to our level 8 spells. This is the hardest selection because level 8 spells in Dungeons & Dragons tend to be weaker than 7th level spells. And so it makes this one a bit of a harder pick because whatever spell we're going to pick, it's probably not going to feel as good as the other Mystic Arcanums we picked. And we don't have a huge selection with Warlocks. If Maze was on there or something, I would gobble that up, but it's not. So what am I going to take? Well, I might take Dominate Monster. This isn't normally the spell that I recommend because it's single target. If they make their save, nothing happens, and legendary resistance is the thing. But if you can work through a creature's legendary resistances, or a creature doesn't have legendary resistance, some high CR creatures actually don't. Balors and Pit Fiends don't have legendary resistance. You catch them with a Dominate Monster and it sticks, then it's pretty effective. And because of the hour duration, this isn't just winning that fight, but then you can bring it into your next combat, and it's basically like a summoned creature. Except with Dominate Monster, it might be a much, much more powerful creature. So that is something I would at least consider, although it's not the kind of spell I normally gravitate to. Another spell I'd consider is Demiplane. Demiplane is a pretty useful utility spell, and if I played something like the Warlock that used Finger of Death in particular, I could see Demiplane being the place where I store my zombies. Then, in the middle of combat, I cast Demiplane and the swarm of zombies comes out. But Demiplane can be used in other ways as well. We can combine it with things like Glyph of Warding that allows us to access what is normally a mobile effect and in an effective way because we can do concentration spells without concentration, that kind of thing. So Demiplane is something I can probably cast every day, and if I think about it carefully, I can cast it in an effective way. And that brings us into our level 9 spells. And for me, the runner-up here is True Polymorph, and True Polymorph is one of the best 9th level spells in the game. But here's the thing about True Polymorph. Although I can cast it every day, I can't always cast it in the most effective way every day. Because really, the best things about True Polymorph are the things you can do in terms of buffing your allies. You can turn your allies into gold dragons, for example. It's basically the one way you can make a high-level monk effective, is True Polymorph them into a gold dragon, suddenly they're effective. And as long as you complete your concentration on it, the effect is permanent. But what happens after all the allies who wanted to be buffed have gotten that buff? Well, now True Polymorph is an enemy debuff that provides a saving throw. And although it's lovely to think about turning your enemies into rocks, it's really not that much more effective than any other take the person out of combat if they fail their save spell, and it's a 9th level spell. So actually, my go-to spell for level 9 spells for Warlocks, pretty much by a country mile, is Foresight. Foresight is, I would say, one of the better 9th level spells in the game. I wouldn't call it the best or even necessarily as good as True Polymorph, but it is absolutely a spell I will cast every day, and it's going to be effective for me every day. And if you've never played in a campaign where you've had Foresight cast on you, you just have to trust me on this. It changes everything. It changes everything like day and night. You get advantage on everything. Everything has disadvantage when doing things against you. And just applying that advantage and disadvantage constantly, without any concentration, for what is usually the entire adventuring day, is massive. It is way better than any non-spell class ability that any class gets, period. So being able to cast Foresight, and remember, it doesn't have to be cast on yourself. You can cast Foresight on an ally. In fact, I would very strongly consider it, depending on who my allies were. So level 17 Foresight is pretty much always going to be the selection I make. And that was a long list, but that's it. That's all the Pact magic I would be considering for most Warlocks, and that is the Mystic Arcanum that I would definitely be looking at for a Warlock that got to high level. Next week, we're going to talk about the Pacts and the Patrons. So I hope you'll join me for that. Until then, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, Optimancers. Talk to you next week.